Welcome back to The Debate on France 24, where we've been discussing Friday's important presidential election in Iran. I'm Robert Parsons, and my guests are Ali Khamenei from International Crisis Group, who's in Washington, Hamid Mousavi, who's a professor of political science at Tehran University, and here in Paris by Ardavan Amir Aslani, who's a political analyst and lawyer. And for this second half of the debate, we are also hoping to be joined from Washington, D.C. by Barbara Slavin of the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council. But before we go to our guests, let's first take a look at this report on the man in Iran who's even more important than the president, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, whose title is Supreme Leader. He's been in power since the death of Ayatollah Khamenei in 1989. Known as a hardline conservative, he's endorsed President Rouhani's rival in the election, Ebrahim Raisi. Clément Bonnereau tells us more.
He may not be president, but he's by far Iran's most influential political figure. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei could make or break the presidential election.
The entire world is looking at Iran. All of them will be looking at you this Friday to see how many people turn out to vote.
Born in Mashhad in northern Iran, Ali Khamenei studied religion in the holy city of Qom. While there, he became involved in protests against the monarchy and was imprisoned several times by Iran's security services. He was a key figure in the 1979 revolution and quickly rose through the ranks. He went on to become Secretary of Defense and was elected president twice in 1981 and 1985. Although not considered one of Iran's top clerics, he succeeded Iran's first supreme leader, Ruhollah Khomeini, in 1989. A hardline conservative, he's taken a hard stance towards Israel and the United States.
The U.S. use money and sex to try to infiltrate Iran. The main targets are the elites, influential people, and decision makers.
As Supreme Leader, Khamenei has the power to select members of the Guardian Council, which is in charge of supervising elections and vetting candidates. That has allowed him to influence past presidential elections. He's been very critical of reformist President Hassan Rouhani and has publicly endorsed his conservative rival, Ebrahim Raisi. The election comes at a critical time for Iran. Ali Khamenei underwent prostate surgery in 2014 and is thought to be gravely ill. In the event of his death, the next president could play a crucial role in the appointment of his successor. He will be chosen by the so-called Council of Experts.
Ali Khamenei, I'd like to go to you again, if I could. Just how important is it in Iran to have the weight of Ali Khamenei behind you in an election like this?
Look, the supreme leader obviously is at the pinnacle of power in Iran. He's the ultimate decider. But you know, he's not a totalitarian leader. He rules by consensus, and the presidents, again, play an important role both in matters of domestic and foreign policy. But what I want to emphasize is that the supreme leader has never openly, publicly sided with a candidate. The reality in Iran, however, is that there is an establishment, there are institutions that are not affected by electoral politics, and those institutions, if they put their weight behind a certain candidate, they can help that candidate go over the threshold. You know, the general formula in Iranian elections is that they control the input, as I said, through the vetting process, but then accept the output. The sole exception to this is the 2009 election, which obviously resulted in an uprising and a disputed result. But generally speaking, the supreme leader tries to remain above the fray in the elections.
Ardavan, if I could go to you next. What do we know about the man he's supporting, Mr. Raisi?
A lot is known about him. A lot is known about him. He's a public figure. He's been in the public arena for decades. He used to be a public prosecutor. massively involved in the Iranian judiciary. I think at some point in time he even assumed the vice presidency thereof. He was in charge. It was one of the four-member committee, as a matter of fact, who in late 80s, after the Iranian-Iraq War, pronounced thousands of death sentences against Iranians, although this apparently he is denying today. He was designated by the supreme leader as governor of the largest religious institution and foundation in the globe, the Imam Reza Foundation in Mashhad. And he, basically speaking, entered the presidential race upon the insistence of the supreme leader. This is not public information. I am not privy to what the supreme leader believes or says, but this is what the Iranians consider as the reality. Because at the end of the day, the next 4 years are going to be fundamental in shaping the future of Iran. In this show of yours, it was mentioned that the supreme leader's health is under question. He's already gone through a rather heavy surgery, and he doesn't want to end up in a situation whereby were he to pass away in the next 4 years, he'd have Rouhani and his globalized government and administration, because that's how they are looked upon by the conservatives, those who are looking towards global village, opening up Iran's frontiers, to be in a position of power, to be able to influence the identification of the next supreme leader. Iran is a religious theocracy, and at the end of the day, as it was mentioned, ultimate power and authority is vested exclusively with the supreme leader, who's not elected. So these 4 years are not only about the economy. They're not only about the stability of Iran within a rather harsh and rough neighborhood. It's also about the potential for the next administration playing a decisive role in determining who the next leader is going to be. And that will have a genuine impact in relation to the path that Iran may take with reference to the world. Even with these two current candidates, if Rouhani would be re-elected, this would signify that Iran is still open for business. Iran is still tendering an open hand towards the international community, striving to come back in order to occupy its legitimate space and place. If it's the other guy, it's going to be a different story. And we may end up in the horrendous years of the Ahmadinejad era, whereby Iran will actually end up being a pariah.
Well, Hamid Mousavi, if I could go to you in Tehran. As we just heard there, if Ebrahim Raisi is elected, it's a different story, at least in terms of international perceptions of Iran. There is no doubt, is there, that he has, in terms of human rights at least, a pretty checkered past. We heard reference to 1988 and his role as one of the judges in the leading to the executions of leftists and dissidents. How big a factor is that in the way people perceive Ebrahim Raisi in Iran today?
Let me just add to the earlier discussion before answering this question that actually the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei in this election has not openly endorsed any of the candidates. In fact, in the early stages of campaigning, there were rumors that Raisi is Ayatollah Khamenei's candidate, and in fact, Ayatollah Khamenei came out and said that even his closest advisors and family members don't know who he is going to vote for. Also, the office of the supreme leader, in a very rare rebuttal, came out and said that the supreme leader has not endorsed Raisi. So I wanted to make that clear. Also, the assembly of experts which chooses the supreme leader is also elected. In regards to your question, the issue of the 1988 controversy has not really been an issue in the presidential debates. There was 3 debates. Of course, there were debates about the economy as well as foreign policy, but not so much about the issue that you raised. Regarding
Rouhani did raise it himself
policy, though,
very briefly. Sorry to interrupt you, but Rouhani did introduce the issue.
Yes, but even with what he said that you've been a judge and you can prosecute everybody. So he didn't explicitly mention that incident.
Well,
and I think the reason he didn't do that is because,
to executions.
in fact, okay.
He did refer to executions.
Right, but you know, Okay, let me correct you there. You know that the 3 judges who were responsible for the 1988, Raisi was not part of them. In fact, the judiciary minister of Rouhani right now, Pur Mohammadi, was one of those 3 ministers. So I think that's why Rouhani didn't want that to be opened up in the debates.
Barbara Slavin in Washington, I'd like to go to you next. Human rights like it or not, is becoming a big issue in this Iranian election. And despite the failings of Mr. Rouhani, the disappointments that people have felt towards his presidency over the last few years, there has at least been an effort on his part to improve things. And during this campaign, he's made an effort to put human rights up at the forefront of his campaign.
Yeah, you know, the record actually has not been that great under Rouhani, but certainly Raisi is not likely to bring an improvement, so people will have that contrast to make. I think what is important to note is that Iranian society keeps evolving, and this has happened through Khatami, through Ahmadinejad, through Rouhani. Women are not wearing their headscarves at night. Young men and women fraternize freely. Lots of makeup, bright, colorful clothes. Music in the streets, all of these things, which would not have happened 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, are happening now in Iran. So I think that in social terms, you know, it probably isn't going to make that much difference. Rouhani has been trying to play the reformist. He talks a good game. I think Iranians are fairly cynical. There are lots of people still in jail, dual nationals, reporters, labor activists, women activists. So I'm not sure this gambit of his is really going to be that successful. I think his biggest argument in favor of re-election is that he has managed to break the stranglehold on Iran internationally. And Iran is now treated not as a pariah, certainly in Europe, many places in the world. Iranians can now do business, hold their head up high a little bit more than they could under Ahmadinejad. And that is in danger of being lost. But in terms of the internal situation, I think there are dynamics at foot that, frankly, neither Rouhani nor Raisi can control.
But is there a sense in which Iranians think that if Rouhani doesn't make it and Raisi becomes president, that things could get a whole lot worse?
It's possible. I'm not in Tehran, so but you know, I just note that there are many, many people in jail, and that Rouhani has not been able to protect people who were seen as being on his side. The administrators of the app Telegram, for example, journalists from prominent reformist newspapers. So, you know, the human rights argument, I'm not sure how important that's going to be. I think it's more a question of Iran's image in the world, the competence of the government ministers who will be carrying out various policies. If we go back to the Ahmadinejad era in terms of some of these people, they were not considered very competent, and a lot of them are surrounding Raisi now. I think these are more important. People are interested in the economy. They're disappointed that the nuclear deal did not bring more jobs and lower unemployment. And in that area, the question is whether they think Rouhani would do a better job or Raisi. Do they want handouts or do they want jobs?
Ardavan, if I could go to you, I'd like to stick with this issue of Raisi just for a bit, because there is this feeling that for Mr. Raisi, the presidency isn't where it stops. He's got his eyes on becoming supreme leader further down the road.
Raisi is a creation of the supreme leader. Whether he has officially or not endorsed the fellow is not going to make a big difference, because the entire Iranian population knows that Raisi was one of the students of the supreme leader. Raisi was designated into every responsibility that he has been occupying ever since the Iranian Revolution, directly through the intervention of the supreme leader. So the supreme leader, whether we like it or not, has a favorite as a minimum. And what is happening now is that, as I think, the supreme leader is worried about who then his next successor is going to be. And I believe that Raisi is currently being groomed, one way or another, to become a potential serious replacement option for the supreme leader.
But if he doesn't get elected as president?
If he doesn't get elected, his chances will go down the drain. But even in the opaque political system of Iran, even that is not a guarantee, and that is not certain. Remember that the supreme leader himself was elected twice as the president of Iran. Yeah. So he is grooming Raisi, one way or the other, to follow on the same path that he did. And they are both on the same ideological wavelength. They're conservatives, they're hostile towards negotiation with the West. Although the supreme leader accepted and endorsed the nuclear deal, he's not a favorite of candidates who want to, shake hands with the Western world. He is someone, basically, who for the last 24 months is extremely strongly advocating a policy based on what he calls an economy of resistance, which means that the Iranian state should be self-sustainable and self-sufficient and not rely on foreign investment nor on having foreign partners entering into the Iranian economy. So you've got totally different philosophies out there. Yeah. And Raisi is, whether we like it or not, on the identical positions that the Supreme Leader has adopted on every single issue. He's a Supreme Leader, so technically speaking, he cannot, have a favorite amongst the two candidates officially. But when you read under the lines, when you look at what the messages are being conveyed out there, Raisi is the Supreme Leader's candidate.
Ali Vaez in Washington, Erdogan just mentioned briefly there the nuclear deal. That seems to be one area in which the candidates seem to be in agreement. Is it likely to change post this election, do you think? Do you think if, for instance, Ebrahim Raisi becomes president, that his policy towards the nuclear deal could change?
No, because I think there is the grand strategy of the system is to preserve the nuclear deal and ensure that if it's undermined or fails, it's the fault of the other side, so that Iran would not once again be isolated as the inflexible party at fault. Winning the international blame game is really the most important strategy that any Iranian government is going to pursue, because this is a systemic decision around which there is enough consensus within Iran. Now, the way I think one can look at this, and it bridges some of the things that Erdogan said with your previous guest, is that the system is facing a fundamental choice here, I think. Is the priority for the system short-term stability? And short-term stability requires a president who has a steady hand and is able to, withstand the pressure that sooner or later is going to come from Washington in the form of new sanctions and new pressures to isolate and contain Iran. Or the priority is the long-term survival of the revolution, in the sense that the Supreme Leader would get a successor that is in line with his vision for the future of the Islamic Republic. I think that's the fundamental choice that the system is facing. The way that it can reconcile these two different priorities might very well be a narrow victory by President Rouhani, so that he is a diminished president in his second term, which is, by the way, the name of the game, and it has been a tradition in the past 3 decades. All Iranian presidents have been weaker in their second terms, but would also allow Mr. Raisi to become a national leader. I mean, if Mr. Raisi loses by, let's say, 40% of the vote and gets 15 million people, somebody who until 2 months ago was not generally known to the public, this is an important asset for him, which could be used in the future. So I think I here disagree a little bit about the prospect that if Mr. Raisi loses, it would also end his chances of succeeding the Supreme Leader. I think it has raised his public profile already, regardless of the results.
Erdogan, what would you say to that?
No, I would say that Ali Vaez is right, and I agree with him. What we have to understand is that no matter which center of power in Iran we look at in relation to the nuclear deal, they have all understood that that has to be saved with all the capabilities that they can deploy. They have to save the nuclear deal, because otherwise the country is just going to go down the drain, and they cannot afford to embark upon another dangerous path towards world isolation. And they know that in order for the system, for the regime to survive, they have to offer something else to this population of Iran. 70% of whom are under the age of 40. They're educated, they're connected to the world. Farsi is one of the most frequently utilized languages on the web. They have to offer something else than social freedom restrictions and unemployment. So this nuclear deal is fundamental for both of them. They also have eyes, and they can see what is coming out of Washington. The forthcoming trip of the U.S. president, who's not known for his wisdom, let's say, to be nice to him, having chosen Saudi Arabia, which considers Iran as being its most definitive existential enemy, as one of the first destinations he's going to visit, is going to be interpreted by the Iranians as a sign of aggression coming out of Washington. The recent sanctions imposed upon Iranian nationals and entities in relation to the missile issue are a problem for the Iranians. And you know, when you look into the Middle East, and the Iranians, both sides, Rouhani and Raisi, they both believe that if they don't fight the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, they would have to fight against it in their own streets. the travel that Trump is considering to effect in Saudi Arabia is a problem for them. In particular because they believe that Saudi Arabia, with its 5 million Wahhabis, is not exactly the representative of the 1.4 billion Muslims out there.
Yeah, Hamid Mousavi in Tehran, I'd like to bring you in on that. To what extent is foreign policy being an issue in this election? We've just heard Erdogan mentioning the fact that Donald Trump's about to go to to Saudi Arabia. Is it a factor at all in this election?
Yeah, so before answering that question, again, if I may add to the earlier discussion, if the idea or the plan was for Raisi to become the next supreme leader of Iran, I don't think it was a smart move for him to become a candidate, because by becoming a candidate for the presidency, you're essentially opening yourself up for criticism and attacks by your opponents. In reality, to become the next supreme leader, there is no requirement for the person to become president first. It's true that Ayatollah Khamenei was president before he became the supreme leader, but there's no such requirement. Regarding the issue of foreign policy, the issue of foreign policy is important in this election because foreign policy directly impacts the Iranian economy, which, as pointed out, is the major issue in this upcoming election. The issue of foreign policy, however, has to be discussed very realistically. With Trump in power in Washington, I really don't see Iran-US relations improving in any significant way, considering that Donald Trump is in power. I know that Rouhani's team is probably pretty happy that, in fact, Trump is arriving in Saudi Arabia after the voting has ended, because essentially the harsh rhetoric that Trump has adopted is actually not very good for Rouhani, because Rouhani's whole narrative is that by fixing relations with the West, he's going to fix the economy, and he has only had very partial success in that regard in the past 4 years.
Barbara Slavin in Washington, I'd like to ask you, as a follow-up to that, do you think Donald Trump's foreign policy, in particular towards Iran, is complicating the task of reformers like Rouhani?
Yeah, certainly I would agree with the previous speaker that any improvement in U.S.-Iran relations is unlikely. But he also could possibly be helping Rouhani in the sense that with the United States now led by a leader who is harsh but is in some difficulty domestically, as we all know, perhaps Iran wants even more than it otherwise would, a pair of steady hands to deal with whatever challenges are coming out of Washington. And Rouhani, certainly, he is Ayatollah diplomat, the sheikh of diplomacy, and he has an excellent team led by Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, and they know how to deal with the United States. They're experienced in dealing with harsh rhetoric and these kinds of provocations. So I think in a way there's an argument not to have a hardliner against a hardliner, as we saw when Ahmadinejad was in power and we had George Bush here, but to have someone who's really experienced in dealing with the world. It's an opportunity also for Iran to drive wedges between the United States and the Europeans and the Asians, the Russians. And certainly Rouhani and Zarif will be very capable of doing that if Trump is perceived as having a feckless foreign policy.
Seen from the other point of view, would it suit the administration in Washington, do you think, to have a hardliner like Ebrahim Raisi as president of Iran? Would it fit the Washington narrative better than having Rouhani there?
Well, it would certainly fit our hardline narrative, and it's been interesting. A couple of neoconservatives, people like Elliot Abrams, have come out publicly and said how much they want Raisi to win. Because, of course, it's much easier to demonize in Iran, led by someone who was implicated in mass executions, someone of his nature. And I think Bibi Netanyahu would also be absolutely over the moon if Raisi wins.
Ardavan, we just a couple of days ago, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, another of the hardliners who was in the race, the mayor of Tehran, pulled out. and the assumption has been that his vote will go primarily to Ebrahim Raisi. Is that an accurate assumption, do you think, a fair assumption?
Nothing is guaranteed in Iran. And candidates coming from the same mold and representing the same ideological framework have a tendency to run in duos because you never know whether the election committee is going to authorize one or both. When you look at Rouhani, he actually has his current vice president running for president against him, if technically speaking. But he's not. And he's going to withdraw, as Ghalibaf did, in favor of one or the other. Of course, not in favor of Raisi. But Ghalibaf does not personify the conservative ideology that is associated with Raisi. He's perceived more as a technocrat, as someone who has delivered to some degree in relation to the management of the large, sprawling city of Tehran.
So his vote could be split,
It could be split, and it's not guaranteed that it's going to go to Raisi. He's playing the conservative card, but there's no guarantee that it's going to go towards Raisi. And furthermore, we don't have any reliable polls in Iran anyhow. So we never knew how much he's going to represent percentage-wise out of the electorate.
Hamid Mousavi, would you go along with that? That it's pretty unpredictable how Ghalibaf's vote's going to go. That it could be split, it could go to Raisi, but just as well to Rouhani.
Yes, so when the Principalists/Conservatives, they started the campaign, there were two options or strategies. One strategy was to present one candidate against Rouhani and be united. 4 years ago, the Principalists had actually 4 candidates and they lost to Rouhani. So the idea was, if we have one candidate, then it would be better. The second strategy would be that no, if we have more than one candidate, we would be better able to prevent Rouhani from getting 50% of the vote. In the Iranian system, if no candidate is able to get 50% of the vote, then the election goes to a runoff stage. So they started with 2 candidates, and midway they changed their strategy. Whether it was the right move or not, we will soon find out. But it is true that Ghalibaf is more centrist and seen as more pragmatic. Nevertheless, I think they were working as a team with Raisi in this election, with Ghalibaf starting a narrative of the 96% fighting against the 4%, with the 4% being the elite political class who are reaping all the economic and political benefits of the country. And he was hoping to essentially transfer that narrative to Raisi.
Thanks very much, I guess that's all we have time for today. Ali Baez, Barbara Slavin, Hamid Mousavi and Ardan Amir Aslani, thanks very much again. And thank you, the viewers, as well, for being with us. Don't go away, more news and headlines to follow.